a former Curtin University professor, aged 64. He's been jailed for 5.5 years. His name is Philip Newsham. He was actually internationally known for the work that he did as a professor, as a scientist. And what struck me is not so much the sentence, 5.5 years. He could be out in 3 with parole, etc. But it's just the fact that for a long period of time, I think by his own admission at one point when he was dealing with police, he said that he'd been able to pose as a much younger person through platforms like Snapchat, WhatsApp, Telegram for years to groom young children to the point where he was asking them to describe certain things, sending images and so forth before the long arm of the law finally caught up with him. And it got me thinking. In recent months, we've seen the Prime Minister come out and say, yes, we discovered now that social media has not been a great thing for young children. It's just not been a great thing. So we're going to figure out how we can ban it for anyone under 16 by way of some form of verification system. How that's to play out, we don't know. But I did start to question in my own mind, and sometimes when I do that, I need advice from people who know better than me. Why on earth is it that these platforms are still enabling people like our very own Professor Philip Newsham to be able to hide and pretend to be someone else without himself having to go through any sort of verification process to prove that he is not using those platforms for his own devious means? Why is there nothing? Why don't those platforms do anything in regard to that? Let's talk now to former police officer. Of course, you know him these days for the work that he does with Surf Online Safe. Paul Litherland joins me in the studio. Thanks very much for your time, Paul.
Gary, great to speak to you and to your listeners again, mate. How are you?
I'm good. Now, this is a grubby case. A qualified person who would have had the trust of people all around him. In fact, this guy, I don't mind putting his name out there, of course, because that's what he deserves. But he was even using Curtin Uni equipment to print off things that were all part of his very depraved habit for young children. I mean, that's repulsive. But there would be how many of these sort of people out there online, and it would seem that the platforms do nothing. Is this one of the great frustrations that you've certainly faced as a police officer and even now?
Yeah, for sure. It's one of the biggest frustrations I've dealt with now for 15, 16 years, Gary. And it got to the point where it was pretty much the catalyst for me leaving the WA Police, walking out of tech crime, going, okay, everyone else seems to be working hard, educators, police, parents, even victims themselves to a degree, or kids themselves. But these playgrounds keep getting designed and offenders can just wander in. So it's very frustrating.
So you got frustrated because while you could do everything you could in your power, and parents could, and other people working in community groups, they could do whatever they had in their power. But the platforms where the billions of dollars are made each year seemingly were doing nothing to prevent people like this professor.
Yeah, and I do a lot of work online, obviously, in my work now, and I go undercover a fair bit myself, Gary. I create accounts regularly just to test systems and to test reporting options and mechanisms. And my biggest concern is the lack of, I suppose, policing of these networks and how difficult it is to be heard as someone who's reporting. So if reporting is actually listened to, then we'd be able to identify and kick off these sorts of offenders a lot earlier, and more importantly, well before they get to a point where they become such recidivist offenders as this gentleman obviously was.
Now, I mean, I'm not, naive enough to not think that someone like him will go out of his way to not be him. He'll take on another identity if that's what's necessary. But could the platforms do more to verify people, or can they always get around it, Paul?
Yeah, there's always a way around. And I equate that to, I was a police officer working in Cottesloe in the 1990s, and we had a huge number of cars stolen. And I remember no sooner the car companies would bring out something to stop a car being stolen, the baddies would bring up a
Yep.
way to get into a car. So it's a very similar analogy. Most of our high-end offenders and these types of offenders will work very hard to get around these systems. And the issue with that is they're quite easy to get around. So anyone who's legitimately maybe a 15-year-old who might want to be dodgy and create a fake account without mum and dad knowing, yeah, it's relatively easy to do, but they might get detected early. But with the right knowledge of the systems and the ability to hide using VPNs and other softwares, you could do it for years without being detected.
But is there enough sentiment from the platform owners to change it? Like, is there enough being done by them in what you see to try and figure out ways? I mean, yeah, these are smart people with smart technology to try and figure out ways where Professor Philip Newsham and all those people like him find it very hard to get through and do what they do. I mean, the grooming, the language that he was using in the exchanges through Snapchat and other platforms, it's pretty obvious he's a deviant and dangerous at that.
The problem we have, and I think from a global perspective, is the size of these networks. The ability to identify an offender in that sense is very, very difficult. Number one, because we look at Instagram or Snapchat, there's billions of users online every day. So being able to pick up from a software perspective or an AI perspective, this sort of content is very difficult. More importantly, AI is not human. It doesn't pick up on these little idiosyncrasies of language and the offenders, the style of conversation they use. And I was working directly with online offenders and as posing as children, and they're very good at what they do. So you can manipulate these AIs quite well. The problem I have and my biggest frustration is the lack of physical policing of those environments because of the amount of content and traffic going on is almost impossible. And we've almost, as a society, allowed that to happen and propagate. So we need to address that. We need to pull that back.
I wonder, again, just me thinking here, we know that agencies in the sort of national security world, they have access to these systems that search for keywords, that look for keywords to determine whether they've got a threat, right? And I wonder whether there's some way that these platforms can have these keyword searches going on all the time, because, I don't want to go into some of the words that he would use when he was talking to 11-year-old children, for example. But those words coming up, if there's a way that it could flag something and someone could start checking who's on the other end of it, I don't know.
Yeah, but we're talking about many US companies here. So the vast majority of our social media networks are run out of the US. So they're starting to push away. We've seen that quite regularly over the last couple of weeks, pushing away from that invasive identification of content online. Many of them are also pushing to encryption systems. So even from a policing perspective, getting content and information out of the networks is almost going to be impossible because of the way they're designed. So this is where myself and other advocates around the world are going, okay, let's adjust that. It's not about invading privacy. I get that a lot. Oh, you're invading free speech or privacy. It's not about that. It's about identifying key offenders such as this on networks and protecting users a bit more.
So Paul Litherland, obviously then when we talk about banning and perhaps getting better messaging out there for parents and kids, that's probably the only real hope you've got that some 11-year-old girl doesn't strike up a conversation with some creep on Snapchat.
And that's why I left the police, mate, because it got to the point where I'm going, my power as a police officer and authority as a police officer is non-existent because these networks don't care. So I've got to get and educate. And mate, we've known each other for a long time now, and it's, I'll be honest with you, listeners, this job is overwhelming at times. And at times I feel like giving up and what's the point? But then I get a kid contact me who says help, and I can advise them and guide them, and that kid might have been stopped from falling down those sort of rabbit holes or getting caught out. And it's what comes back to my frustration constantly is the networks aren't working hard enough. They'll tokenize and say, oh yeah, we're doing this, doing that, but it's not happening. And the fact that we're now pushing away from everyone else moving forward to protect users, we're now pushing back, and that's concerning. That should be concerning for anyone who has kids, especially.
All right. Well, you know, it was interesting to read in that particular case, just so you know, that it was an older brother that saw something on the younger sister's phone and jumped on
Tweet to concern, yeah.
and worked out that this guy was not a 16-year-old as he was pretending to be. So,
And I had an exact case like that last year, mate, just quickly with exactly the same thing, an 11-year-old girl being groomed by an online predator. Brother just was he was 14, 15. I'd spoken to his group a number
right.
of years, and he just messaged me, sent me screenshots of the content, and he's gone, Paul, can you just check this out? I'm worried. And that saved his daughter from being sexually assaulted because the offender went on to sexually assault a number of other kids in WA. So it's getting that voice out there, and especially the younger ones, to go, this is no longer acceptable. We're not just numbers on a screen as such.
Paul Litherland, I appreciate you coming in. I know you're off to give another talk to one of the school groups today, so thanks very much for dropping by and giving us your time.